Hey everybody, I thought I would make another video in case you weren't able to come to class the other night. I'm basically going to go through the notes that we went through and explain it so it makes a lot more sense when you're reading it, not having the benefit of hearing it live in class. So the first slide here I just thought was kind of funny. A lot of times photographers will hear, "Oh my gosh, you have such a good camera." Well, I thought this was a fun little picture. We were out shooting clay pigeons, and I handed my husband my very expensive, nice camera and lens, and I said, "Take some pictures of me while I was shooting." And this is what I ended up with. So just remember, it's the photographer, not the camera, that makes the picture. I did tell him I was going to show you this. Okay, so we're going to do a quick overview of last week. So if you look at your camera's dial and you break it into 4 quadrants, you've basically got different levels of control. So the green button is auto. And think of auto as your iPhone, okay? The camera controls everything. You have no say in what the final picture will look like. Now, the reason it looks a little better than your iPhone is because of the lens. So you've got different lenses, you've got different things like that that do make it look different than your iPhone, but it's essentially doing this. The camera is making all the decisions, what the shutter speed is, what the ISO is, what the aperture is. Now, when you come over here, this was our assignment last week, and that's still you're in we call it a semi-automatic mode, but basically you're giving the camera a hint of what you want it to look like. Are you shooting a portrait? Are you shooting a landscape? Do you have action? But ultimately, as we saw in the assignment, the camera is still going to pick what it's going to pick to get the proper exposure. So it doesn't always make sense when you look at the aperture that it chooses for portrait, for example. It's just a little computer that's choosing the level of control to make the exposure. Now here's where we're going to spend the bulk of, or all of our time for the next 2 weeks, and that's Aperture Priority Mode, which is AV in Canon and A on everybody else. I should change that. And then TV on Canon is Shutter Priority, and S for everybody else. I will get that updated. So we're looking at Aperture Priority this week, and we're going to look at Shutter Priority next week. So you've got some control over the camera because you're choosing whether you're prioritizing the aperture or whether you're prioritizing the shutter. You can also control some other things that we won't really talk about in this class, but that's where you focus. You can start to customize your white balance. You can control a lot more things in these modes. Here, the camera doesn't let you change anything. Now over here, you're controlling absolutely everything, and that's out of the scope of this class because it's very complicated. But once you master this, you can start learning about how to control more things in the camera, but we won't cover this. It'll be mentioned here and there, but that's it. Oops. Now this week we're going to look at aperture priority, and the aperture controls depth of field. And if you remember from last week's class, depth of field is how much of the picture is in focus. So here, if you look at the metals in focus, the trees in the background are completely out of focus. And these little balls of light back here, that's called bokeh. And you can see the water droplets have turned into bokeh. Basically, the out of focus part of the picture is what is called bokeh. You can see the Coke bottle here. You can see these Mardi Gras beads. This line is in focus, and then these start to fall out of focus into little balls of light. So this is a great way to expose the subject. Now, I really didn't show you anything in here that's a large depth of field. So you can also control landscapes, keeping things completely in focus. Here, this is actually a chain link fence that we're shooting through. So you can focus on your subject and then blur out the things around it for some creative effect. So this is the part, I don't want this to throw you. Don't freak out when you see this, but basically every exposure, if you remember from last week, we talked about the correct exposure means it's not too bright and it's not too dark. So for every camera, no matter what you're looking at, the exposure is made up of aperture. That's how much light comes into the camera via the lens. The shutter speed, and that's how much light comes into the camera via the shutter. It's opening and closing just like a curtain. And then your ISO, and then that's how much light is coming into your camera via the sensor. So when you raise the ISO, it makes your sensor more sensitive to light, and it allows more light in. So shutter speed is just the amount of time the shutter is open. Aperture is the size of the opening in the lens when the picture is taken. And then the ISO is the measure of the digital camera sensor's sensitivity to light. So the bigger the number, the more sensitive to light. Also likely more grain, especially on older cameras. Now depth of field, don't let this throw you. It's just how much of the picture is in focus. A shallow depth of field means not very much is in focus. A large depth of field means everything is sharp from front to back. So here is an actual, you can see the aperture here. So if you take your camera and you look inside the lens, you're going to see a little hole right there and some blades. So the blades are actually the aperture blades, and these open and close to let in more light. So at f22, this is where it gets a little bit confusing. The larger the number, the smaller the opening, okay? So you can see it goes from 22 to 16, the hole gets a little bit bigger. Down to f8, a little bigger. 5-6, a little bigger. 2-8, a little bigger. 1-4, a lot bigger. All right, we're going to go over this in more detail, but one of the things that it takes a little while for this to make sense, but the lower the number, the larger the opening to let light in. Now here's a little demo that I wanted to show you. First of all, let's take a look at these two mason jars. These mason jars were in my backyard, sitting on my deck. Here's my deck. These are the woods right behind my deck, or kind of far away, maybe 20-30 feet. So here I'm shooting at aperture 1.4. So if you look over on this chart, 1.4 is a very wide open hole. The aperture blades are opening up really big to let a lot of light in, okay? So at 1.4, we call that shooting wide open, and that's why it's called shooting wide open, because the aperture blades are literally wide open. You get a lot of blur. And the way I remember this is it's like looking at your alarm clock in the morning. If you were to open your eyes really, really big and stare at the light, everything would get really blurry. Okay, so big opening, blurry background. Now on the other end of the spectrum, that's even smaller than this, you can see it's like a little pinhole. So this would be the one above here. It's like a little teeny pinhole of light. But if you think about the alarm clock example again, if you squint and make your eyes really small, the alarm clock comes into focus. And so you can see that the background is very in focus. Oh goodness, sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button. And this is going to look a lot more like what you might get from an iPhone versus over here. This is the biggest difference between kind of an iPhone picture and a picture with your other camera, is the fact that you can really blur out the background. Now, if you have an iPhone 7 or 8 and you have portrait mode, this is what it's attempting to do, but it's not quite the same as using a lens. You can still kind of tell the difference. It's okay, but it's not great. So let's go over here to this side. I pulled this chart off of Pinterest. This is not something that I made. But what we're going to do here is we're going to change the aperture, which means we're going to change the opening of the lens. We're going to change how much light is coming into the sensor. But we're not changing anything else. We're not changing the shutter speed, and we're not changing the ISO. Those remain constant. So if you look at this first picture here, you can see it's kind of dark. I don't see a lot of details in the shadows, and overall the exposure is dark. Okay? I'm not going to change anything else. I'm just going to take my aperture from f16 to f11, and remember, as the number gets lower, the hole gets bigger, which this hole is what lets in light. So you can see here, it's still a little bit dark, but I'm getting more detail in the shadows. It's a little bit overall brighter, right? So we keep working our way down. The hole gets bigger, a lot more light is coming in. You can say I'm starting to get detail in the picture. I'm starting to get some details in the shadows down here, but I'm still not really getting a lot of detail over here. So I'm going to come, oh, I'm pointing to this one. Then I'm going to come down here. I'm going to open up the aperture even bigger to 5.6. And this looks on my screen, it depends, on the TV last night it was a lot brighter, but on my screen right here, it looks pretty good. Like I can see the details in the highlights. I can start to see some details in the shadows. Now I come down here to F4. I let even more light in. And it's starting to get a lot brighter. And the shadows are starting to get a little bit gray, like a little bit more washed out. It's probably close between these two would be a proper exposure. Now F28, I'm getting even more light in here. It's getting bright. I'm getting really bright shadows. It's starting to look a little more washed out. And I continue down here, more light, more light. I'm losing detail in some of these highlight areas, all the way down to 1.4 where I've really lost a lot of detail down here. I can't see a lot of in the white. I've lost all that information. So that's what happens as you open the aperture blade, you're letting more and more light in if nothing else changes. So let's go back to my mason jar example. I basically put my camera on a tripod and I shot this mason jar from 1.4 all the way to the maximum aperture of f22. So this is the picture you saw on the other page, this is the other picture, and then this is everything in between and how the background changed. And this is essentially what I want you to do for your assignment, is I want you to take a subject and I want you to see, as you change the aperture, how it changes the look and feel of the photo. So when we're on the really wide open side or the low number, we have a blurry background. Oh goodness, sorry. We call this shooting wide open. We've got a very fast shutter speed because if you think about it, there's a lot of light coming through that lens, so we have to open and close the shutter very quickly or it'll wash it all out to white. So it lets in lots of light and it gives you really nice smooth bokeh. All right, now let's go to the other side. Here we've got, it's very in focus. We call this stop down, and basically it's because that aperture ring is closing very small. It's stopping down. We're going to have a very slow shutter speed because that pinhole of light is only letting in a little trickle of light, so we have to leave the shutter open longer for the light to flow in. Sometimes it's easier to picture light if you think of it as water. So if you need a really fast door to open and close, otherwise that water is going to flow in so fast it's going to wash away the whole picture. Here, if you're throwing water through a small hole, you're going to have to pour that water for a lot longer for it to get on the picture. So you're going to need to leave it open longer. So this shuts out light, and here you're going to see later, this is where you can start to get cool starbursts for some kind of fun different effects. Now look at this here. This is sort of a math formula. You notice my aperture is not changing, or not my aperture, my exposure is not changing at all. All the pictures are neither too light nor too dark. They're all perfect. The ice cubes look exactly the same in every single picture, right? So as we change the aperture to let in less light, the shutter speed starts to slow down, slow down, slow down, slow down, slow down, slow down. If you've ever heard your shutter go click, click, instead of it goes click, click, it's because it's opening and closing very slowly to let enough light in to get a properly exposed picture. Here, this is where you hear the it goes really fast because 1/1250th of a second, you can only let in that much light, otherwise it's just going to blow out all the detail and all of the highlights. So as you take away the light, you have to slow the shutter speed to let in more light via the shutter versus the aperture. So I hope that makes sense. So it's always the opposite. And we'll learn about the other side of the equation next week when we look at shutter speed. So focal length. What focal length is, it's basically, it's how far your camera zooms in. So on a 70 to 200 lens, it goes from 70 millimeters wide to 200 millimeters. Basically, you can zoom in a lot closer. And then the other numbers on your lens, so look at your lens. Many of you will see 70 to 300, or you'll see 18 to 55, or I think some of you have 18 to 200. So these are just how wide it will go and how far zoomed in it will go. And if you only have one number, say like a 50, that means it only goes to 50. So if you want to zoom in closer, you need to walk closer. If you want to go out farther, you have to walk backwards. So we call that zoom with your feet. Now the other number on your lens, so for example, if it says 18 to 55, 3.5 to 5.6, 3.5 is the lowest aperture that your lens will go at 18 millimeters wide. 5.6 is the lowest the aperture will go at 55. It actually changes when you rotate from 18 to 55. This number will change back and forth. If you have a fixed lens, or what we call a prime lens, like a 50 millimeter 1.4, the aperture does not change. Or if you have a 2470 f2.8, there's only one number there, not a range. It means at 24, it's 2.8, and at 70, it's 2.8. And those lenses tend to be a little bit more expensive. So a great article, click on this link if you want to learn a little bit more. And then I want to show you these next pictures. I did not take these. These are taken from this lens, this blog post. So I don't want to make sure I don't take credit for this, but thank you, Leah, for taking these pictures. These pictures were taken with 3 different lenses, and the baby did not move, the background did not move, and the photographer did not change where she was standing. The only thing that changed was the lens. So I wanted to talk about different lenses give you different looks. So if you look at the baby here, this is taken with an 85 millimeter lens. It's a prime lens, which means you zoom with your feet, you walk forward or backwards. It zooms in to 85 millimeters, so it's pretty, it goes pretty far away, and 1.2 is very wide open. This is actually a very expensive lens, but if you tried it with a cheaper lens, an 85 1.8, you would still get similar results. And so what this does is it really blurs out the background. It gives you a nice, creamy, smooth, very pleasing to the eye background, and it really makes the baby pop off the background. Now, longer lenses, when I say longer lenses, I mean bigger numbers. They also tend to compress or make the background appear closer to the baby than it really is. Now let's go down to here. This is a 50 millimeter 1.4. So the photographer has not moved, the baby has not moved, and the background has not moved. We've only changed lenses. So again, we're shooting very wide open, very low aperture, but you can see much more of the scene in this one. So you're getting a lot more of the environment in there. And you're getting little, instead of kind of like these big smooth bokeh back here, you're getting more little teeny balls of light coming through the trees here. And this is really nice bokeh back here. So you're getting lots and lots of little circles. Now this is taken with a single lens, a 2470 2.8. So it means it goes to 2.8. Oh goodness, did it again. At 24, which is wide, and then 70, which is kind of between these. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I'm using like a little Wacom tablet and I keep touching the wrong thing. So this lens zooms into kind of between these two lenses. So here you can see at 24, you can see a whole lot more around the baby, and the background is not as blurry as the other 2 lenses. So this is actually pretty wide, and wide tends to exaggerate the distance. So where this look, the background over here looks like it's very close to the baby, you can see that the background's actually pretty far away. Now when I zoom into 70 here, you can see I've got a lot more blur. So you always, on your zoomy, I call it the zoomy end of your lens, you're going to always get a lot more blur. And then the bokeh looks a little bit different than the other lenses in the background. If you have any questions on that, just let me know. So I'm just going to walk through some pictures that I've taken and show you kind of how this works. So this is aperture at 1.4, so very wide open. I'm focused on this right here, and so you can see everything in front of it is out of focus and everything behind it is out of focus. So when you focus on something at a very low aperture, we call that the focal plane. So basically that means whatever is in front or back of it will be thrown out of focus. Here I'm focused on the propeller on the toy, and then everything behind it is falling out of focus. This picture, you can see I shot at a pretty wide open aperture, 2.0, pretty low. And you can see that she's in focus, but even her little pom-pom on her hat is falling out of focus. The restaurant back here, you can't see anything behind her. It's completely out of focus. And even the things in front of her, the cup, her hands, anything not on the focal plane of her eyes, in front and behind her, is starting to fall out of focus. Now here, when I took this picture of Riley, I knew that she has these amazing light-colored eyes. And I had seen another photographer did a really cool thing where they shot through these twigs, and really all you focused on was the eyes, and I knew I wanted to do this for Riley. So this picture would look completely different if you used an iPhone, because this would be in focus and the woods behind her would be in focus. Here I shot at a really wide open aperture, 1.8. I focused on her eyes, and then we held some twigs from Michael's in front of her and shot through them. And you can see that all of this is blurred out. I think there's even a twig kind of in front of her face, but because it's so close to the lens, it's actually blurring away and you don't even see it. So here this really makes her eyes pop out. And this is straight out of camera. There's no editing or anything here. That's exactly what it looks like after I took the photo. Now I put a family picture of myself in here for one reason, and that's to show you I shot this at f8, which is a much larger depth of field. I put it on a tripod and then I ran to get in the picture. But what you can see here is when you focus on the front row, you don't want the middle row and the back row to fall out of focus by shooting at too shallow depth of a field. So I increased my depth of field to 8.0. I focused on the front row, and then the middle row and the back row, and even the fence all the way in the back, they're all completely in focus, okay? You can even see the wood pile in the back, like a little junk pile here. You can still see it because it's got a very large depth of field. Everything's in focus, and that's what you want to do with families or groups. You don't want, my dad to have very sharp eyes and then everybody all fuzzy in the back. That doesn't look very good. So there's an example of when you'd use a larger depth of field. Now here's a creative thing that you can do. When you get up into the larger apertures, f16, f22, I think anything after 7 you can start to get this. Anything that's like shiny, like sun peeking behind the clouds. It's kind of got to be peeking behind something, but you can start to get sunbursts. So you'll see sparkly sunbursts on water, sequins, sunshine, wherever there's light, light posts at night. So give this a try if you want. Put it on a higher aperture and then just try taking some different pictures at night or of water and see if you can get little starbursts. It's kind of a fun thing to do. Now here, these are 2 different drawings, and I want to show you how to achieve background blur. And it's very important. The first thing is you want your subject to be away from your background. If you put your subject right against the wall or right against the Christmas tree or right against the woods, it's not going to blur out, and you're going to be like, but I thought I was at aperture 1.4 and it was supposed to look blurry. Well, the second component to that is you have to move your subject away from the background to achieve this result. So you need to be fairly close to the subject, either physically, or you can back up but zoom in with your lens. So you're either close to your subject physically or by your lens. And then your subject is far away from your background. If you have these two things happening, you will get a blurry background at a low aperture. Now, if you don't want a blurry background, you can still shoot wide open. You just need to move further away from your subject. So if you have less distance between your subject and the background and you move away from your subject, you'll get a much less blurry background than this scenario. So sometimes you do not want a blurry background. So these are ways that you can shoot at a higher aperture, but you can also shoot at a low aperture and move away from your subject, and that'll reduce the blur as well. So I hope that makes sense. Your lens choice is going to make a huge difference in blurred background as well. So you're going to see less blur at a wide angle, so like your 18 to 55s, you're going to see less blur at 18 than you will at 55. Because wide angle lenses, think your iPhone, tend to exaggerate distance, and they also tend to be more in focus. That's why, generally speaking, your iPhone is very in focus. You'll see more background blur with a long lens. So those of you with a 70 to 300 or an 18 to 200, things are going to be a lot more blurry with when you're zoomed in to 200 to 300 than they are at 70. So that's a way that you can really make your subject pop off the background by by zooming in with your long lens, even if the aperture is a little higher. So even if your aperture is at 5.6, which isn't super low, at 300 you're going to get a lot of background blur. And then with your kit lens, your 18 to 55, some people say you can't get blur with your kit lens, but you can. You just need to remember the principles that we talked about, okay? So first of all, you need to zoom in to 55, and then you need to get physically close to your subject because 55 doesn't zoom very far, so you don't want to be standing far away from your subject. You want to actually stand fairly close in front of them, and then you want to pull them away from your background. So it's exactly this scenario here. If you have your 55, zoom it into 55, stand close to your subject, and pull your subject away from the background, and you will get a nice blurry background even with that lens. Here's some examples. This was a picture I took at a Browns game a few years ago, and I had a 24 to 105 lens, and it only goes to f4, so it's not a super wide open lens. It only goes to f4, and here I zoomed out, so I get a lot more of the environment. I can tell what's going on. We've got this super fan here yelling, the game's sold out. You can see that he's got Browns tattoos. Here I zoom in on the tattoos, and you can see between 24 and 105, I'm really isolating those tattoos. My eye is going right to the tattoos, and this is just sort of giving a nice out of focus depth of field back here. And you know exactly what the subject of this picture is. Here the subject is the guy, right? Here the subject is his tattoos specifically. And that's how you can kind of tell a story. Neither is right or wrong, but you want to understand what your lens does in order to tell that story. Here again, we're at a swim meet. I'm using the same lens, 24 to 105. But here I'm out at 24, so I'm wide. So you can see the distance between the swimmers seems a lot bigger than the distance between the swimmers zoomed in at 105, because another thing that longer lenses do is they compress the subjects. They seem closer together, even though physically they're the same distance apart. So here I'm shooting wide. I'm getting everybody in the background. Here I'm stepping back, but I'm pulling in with my lens and getting in closer. And I'm isolating the subject more, and I'm getting a little bit more, the distance is compressed with the lens. Just ignore this slide. I think we already talked about everything. The only thing we maybe didn't talk about was Christmas trees. So what I want you to think about here is if you are putting your kids in front of a Christmas tree and you stand them right against, their backs are touching the needles, you are not going to get those little balls of light that maybe you've seen in advertisements or whatever. In order to get that, you need to pull the kids away from the tree, shoot close to them, zoomed in, and then the lights will all turn into little balls of light, okay? And it'll look very different than if you snapped it with your iPhone standing right in front of the tree. So too bad we're not doing this before Christmas, or you could try it out. One lens that I really recommend is we call it the Nifty 50. It's a 50 millimeter fixed aperture, which means you zoom with your feet. It's called a prime lens. And all the camera manufacturers make them, and they go to 1.8. They're pretty inexpensive. They're made of plastic. They're not super high-end opticals, but they're great lenses, especially in good light. They're not as great a lenses in low light, but they're not bad for the price. I think Canon's about $125, Nikon's around the same, Sony's about, I just paid $179 for mine. So they're affordable, and they're a great way to introduce yourself to lower apertures. They go much lower than any of the kit lenses that come with your camera. So I'd highly recommend, if you have an extra $125 and you think you're going to stick with this, to invest in this lens, because you'll really like it, especially if you're doing anything like if you have to go into a classroom or anywhere indoors where you need more light. This is a great affordable way to do that without having to pop a flash. And then, so some tips and tricks. We pretty much talked about this, but the further the subject is from the background, the better blur you will get. So make sure you try that. Be careful using aperture priority when the sun's going down or you're indoors, because it's going to drop the shutter speed to let you get more light, which is going to end up giving you motion blur if you're not paying attention. Now, one way to combat that is to raise your ISO. And your ISO will automatically pull your shutter speed up, because your shutter speed has to block out that extra light, which means it'll freeze your subject. Basically, for sports, you don't want your shutter speed to drop below 1/500th of a second, or you're going to start to see feet, hands, fast-moving subjects blur. If you have got a really distracting background, I'll give you an example. I like to shoot senior pictures in Buford, and we go in a back alley, and there's literally dumpsters, there's trash bins, but if you shoot at a low aperture and get really close to your subject, all that ugliness turns into really cool textures and patterns, and you get rid of the distractions, but you can keep the color and the visual interest. So that's why I like to shoot wide open a lot of the time. And then as you start practicing at low apertures, the 1.8, the 2.8, even the 3.5s, it's going to take a lot of practice to nail the focus. The camera likes to focus on whatever is closest to you. So just keep practicing. You're not going to get it right away, but practice makes perfect, and it's really worth it. So I made a YouTube video, so I want you to go ahead and watch that. It'll be in an email, and that'll tell you exactly what to do for the assignment. That's pretty much in the assignment, so I'm going to skip this. And then don't forget to follow my